there we go. We're delighted that Scott offered to give us this talk, which is all about what we can learn from sustainability science and transdisciplinary approaches and systems thinking, and how we can apply that to making the changes that really matter to transform our world. And that sounded like a great way to start the new year to me, so, which is why we scheduled it at this time. Scott has worked with us at ACAN for a couple of years now as our Eco Streets project manager and then consultant with the project reaching out onto the new estates here. And it's been a great joy to work with Scott, and he's added and contributed a great deal to the work of Alton Climate Action over the last year or two. So I'm really looking forward to this talk. Use the chat in the usual way if you want to make comments or put questions in or discussion points in for us to come back to later. But apart from that, Scott, hand over to you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Yeah, thank you for giving me this opportunity to give this presentation today. I warn you, it is fairly academic. I'll try to make it as entertaining as I can, but it has a definite academic edge to it. So, it's very much based on my studies. I studied environmental and sustainability sciences. And one of the professors that was one of the leading people with these studies was actually a leading thinker within transdisciplinary and systems thinking. And so this is based very much around a very good article that he wrote, which is also linked in the presentation. So I encourage everyone to dig deeper into this if you're interested in it, because it's really interesting stuff. All right, I will go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so I want to start off with this quote by Franklin D. Roosevelt: "Never before have we had so little time in which to do so much." And I think we all know, looking at the latest climate news, that yes, we have indeed very little time and we have a lot to do. So finding the points in society where we can affect changes that will really lead to important changes, rather than just kind of like digging around in shallow leverage points where it might seem that we get some easy rewards for our work, but in the end we're not going to change much. We just simply don't have time for this anymore. So I think this science looking into effective leverage points to affect transformative change is really, really important. Now, sustainability science itself is actually still considered an emerging field of research, which means in terms of scientific time spans, it's relatively young. It's dealing with the interactions between natural and social systems, and then how these interactions affect the challenge of sustainability, which is meeting the needs of present and future generations. So we have these interactions between natural and social systems, which is basically what ACAN is all about. We're trying to, we're working within the social system, but we're really trying to affect, or to affect the interactions between the social, the human part of it, and the natural systems. We see that the research network in sustainability sciences, and that's why I said it's really considered an emerging science, was only kind of establishing itself from the year 2000 onwards. So about 24, 25 years now that sustainability science has been a thing. So in comparison to other fields of natural sciences, it's really quite young. It is now a very active, very worldwide network, and it also always has had, and that's a difference to other natural sciences, it has always had a political dimension. That's what it kind of what it shares with social sciences, because from the beginning there was this political aspect of sustainable development that was integrated into a lot of political agendas already from Stockholm 72 onwards, but especially after the Brundtland Report and Rio de Janeiro in 1992. It has been a staple of political agendas as well. So we have a field where science and politics and policy are all kind of working, sometimes with one another, sometimes against one another, but it's definitely it makes it quite complicated because we always have this aspect to it. There are, within sustainability sciences, there are 7 major research questions that have been formulated. And I especially want to look at the one that I think is especially important for groups like ACAN. How can, and I can actually, funny enough, not see this right now. Hang on, I must see if I can somehow, yes, I think this is better. How can society most effectively guide or manage human environment systems toward a sustainability transition? So this is really what we're trying to do. Guide and manage the social systems towards a sustainability transition. So this is one of the 7 major research questions within sustainability sciences, and that's why they are important for groups like us to be kind of aware of, that there is a whole scientific research around this. So sometimes when you're doing the groundwork, you kind of forget about that, but there is a huge body of research that is kind of backing up what we're doing, and that can inspire us if we find the time to read any of the articles. That is because of course groundwork tends to take up all of our time. One of the outcomes of this of these research questions, and especially of research question number 5, can scientifically meaningful limits be defined that would provide effective warning for human environment systems? This research question has resulted in the concept of the 9 planetary boundaries, which I can imagine most of you have probably heard of, developed by the Stockholm Resilience Center. Now, these 2 graphics are, I think, 2 years, 3 years apart. The smaller one is the older one, and we can see that the newer one kind of looks more alarming. If we look at the climate change section of it, for example, we see that we've gone even further outside of the safe operating space by now. We can also see that research has really grown. So in the older graphic, a lot of the spaces aren't filled in, and that's because there was a lack of research. Now, for example, the research on novel entities, planetary boundaries of novel entities, which includes chemicals, new types of materials, for example, plastics, and genetically modified forms of life. That was simply an area where there wasn't a lot of data. Now there is data, and what a surprise, we're way outside of the safe operating space. So this is a concept that is really useful in making visible just how close we are to the precipice. And this is used a lot in policy making and in outreach work. And this came out of one of the research questions of sustainability sciences. Yes, so it's really quite depressing to look at. And there's a whole sort of think tank behind the planetary boundaries, which I'm not going to go into now in detail, but I encourage you, if you're not very familiar with this research, to have a look at it. Not all of it is as depressing as just looking at this graphic. They also do offer a lot of constructive ideas on how to deal with the challenges that arise from the situation that we've put ourselves into. Now, all of sustainability science is very much defined by transdisciplinarity, which means that 2 or more discipline perspectives transcend each other to form a new holistic approach, which kind of sounds like that could be the could be on a flyer for some kind of new age workshop. Transcend, holistic, kind of sounds like we're going to go and meditate in the woods somewhere, which would probably be a nice thing to do. Kind of recenter ourselves after seeing the planetary boundaries. But what that means is, and I really like this graphic because it kind of explains it very nicely. There's multidisciplinarity, there's interdisciplinarity, and then there's transdisciplinarity. So we see that in multidisciplinarity, it's just there's one problem that a lot of different disciplines, scientific disciplines, think about, and they kind of all give their point of view what's on this problem or what the solution could be. So it's basically you've just asked a bunch of people to give their opinion, and they give their with their knowledge, they coming out of their field, they give you information about it. Interdisciplinarity is when disciplines come together, and by working together, they kind of form a new discipline or a new field of practice, and then this new discipline goes and looks at the problem or the solution that we're looking at. And then transdisciplinarity means that all sorts of fields come together, which can be scientific disciplines, but it's also other fields. It's stuff, like I said, politics, policy making, management, design. They all come together, throw in their knowledge, create a completely new field of practice like sustainability sciences, and then they can deal with more complex problems and situations. So it's basically asking the hive mind. That's what transdisciplinarity is. It's really everyone's stepping out of their comfort zone, everyone's stepping out of their discipline, and working together with an open mind to address complex problems. So this, and the important thing there is that this goes outside of science. It goes into the realm of non-scientific stakeholders, communities. So again, the work that we are doing is part of this kind of transdisciplinary approach, because we base a lot of what we do on science, but at the same time we are working on the ground, we're working in the community, we're working within a social frame, and we're addressing very complex problems. So for those who think that a transdisciplinary approach is something that's happening somewhere in the ivory tower, that's exactly not the case. It's something that's very much in the middle of society, and the goal is very nicely phrased, the understanding of the present world, which is a nice goal, which exactly the point here is it cannot be accomplished within disciplinary research. So this was a huge thing when that first came up, because it was breaking down these disciplinary barriers, which were extremely strong. I still, I started university in the early 2000s, and I can definitely attest for that. That was still very old-fashioned, and disciplinary boundaries were totally a thing, and the disciplines really struggled to sort of do even the interdisciplinary work. So it was a big step change in science when this came up. Whereas now my new studies, which I finished in 2018, it was very, very inter and transdisciplinary from the start. So you can really see that something major has changed there, and it was a transformative change in the heads of a lot of people working in science, which is good and kind of proves that that is possible. And it's very much connected to the whole concept of systems thinking. So systems thinking basically means that it's no good to isolate any component of a system, because as soon as you isolate one thing, it'll appear different than when it is within the system that it's normally in. So for those of us who are working within societal systems, or within natural systems, or within a mixture of the two, we know that all of these systems, there's so many interdependencies that it is really quite impossible to isolate a single part, a single component of the system and try to just look at that component. And the thinking process within systems thinking is really that every system has feedback loops. There are one thing that causes another thing, and that will cause another thing, and that thing will then cause another thing, and if these two things happen, then that will cause another thing. So it's very much like it creates a very complicated kind of web structure, rather than just sort of like, well, if A and B happen, and then there's C, and then there's definitely D. So this is sort of this event-oriented thinking, which is classical natural science thinking. You're trying to break everything down. You're trying to find root causes, and then they start a chain of events, and then you can isolate any point in that chain and look at that and try to understand it. That is very appealing because it makes things a lot easier. Systems thinking is not appealing because it's very, very complicated. Feedback loops are drag. Things change all the time. It becomes extremely hard to qualify things scientifically. A lot of essays or a lot of scientific work around systems thinking becomes incredibly complicated because they try to kind of put all of the aspects of one complicated system into one essay, and it's just a nightmare. So systems thinking is a big challenge, but at the same time, once you kind of get into it and you start accepting the chaos of it in a way, you start realizing that this is really what we need to do when we're looking at natural and social systems, because they are so complicated that it's really difficult to just look at one component without looking at the others. This is the definition of systems by the woman who basically invented the whole thing. A system is a set of related components that work together in a particular environment to perform whatever functions are required to achieve the system's objective. So these are the feedback loops within a system, and the system's objective could be anything. Anything can be a system. If the system is capitalism, it will have certain objectives that it wants to achieve, like growth and profit. A natural system could have the objective of balancing certain things out. So anything can be a system. We cannot think of anything within a system. There's some really nice graphics around system thinking from a company called Disrupt Design, which I've also linked on the end of the presentation. And this is very important within system thinking, is graphic system mapping, because if you just talk about it, it's just really confusing, and we really need, and this is where art also plays an important point. We need to be able to visualize things much more than with this straight line thinking, which we can kind of comprehend if we just read words on paper. But with systems thinking, you're going to come across a lot of like graphics and pictures, and tries to make it somehow more tangible. This I'm just going to skip over. I'm going to, anyway, in this presentation, it's a very long presentation, I'll skip over some things, but you're welcome to ask about it later, or also just we're going to make the slides available, and then you can read up on it, and there's a very extensive reading list in the end. Yeah, so with system thinkings and leverage points, we have to basically, because we're in these complicated feedback loops, we have to move beyond thinking of the idea of a change that will fix the system. We have to move to a way of thinking of that there are going to be several what I call leverage points in this presentation, that may be adjusted to improve the system. Obviously, if you have very complex systems, there's never going to be a one-size-fits-all approach. It's always going to depend on what exactly you're working with. every system comes with a context. So if we're thinking now about societal change, the way that we envision solutions and deliver local work must always reflect the values, the context, the cultures of each different community of stakeholders. So we can never say, oh, just because this worked in Alton, it's probably also going to work somewhere in Malawi, right? If I not take these 2 points, because it's just a different culture, a different context. And this has really influenced a lot of work that's been done by Western scientists and workers in other cultures, because traditionally we have this colonial approach to helping people, right, with like sort of coming in there with our context and our culture and our values, and trying to help people in the global south, for example, by building up things there for them. And that has, of course, all changed. Charity work is now very different. And this is kind of part of that. This is the same sort of thinking, that you're going to look at a system within its context, and you're going to try to not have the one solution, the one change that's going to fix everything, but you're going to look for all of the little leverage points that you can poke into, that you can adjust to improve the system that you're trying to change. Now, like I said, politics and policy come in here, and there's of course a lot of interventions on the political and the policy side within sustainability, but the problem there is that they often target tangible but essentially weak leverage points. So it's going to be interventions that are easy but have limited potential for change. So, for example, things like banning plastic straws, that would be like the worst example. You have the big problem of plastic and plastic waste, and this whole system of single-use plastics, and where do they end up, and this whole circular thing. And then someone goes and says, right, we're going to ban plastic straws. It's very tangible. It's something that people can understand easily. They used to get all the plastic straws at McDonald's, and now they don't anymore. But the potential for transformational change is probably close to zero. You're not going to really change anything by something like that. And then this is now a very weak leverage point, but you can kind of find this in all stages. But of course, the potential for transformational change is often not what these interventions really want, because if the intervention kind of comes from the system itself that is trying to maintain its status quo, it's not really going to want to change. So systems are also self-preserving. So if we're within a political system like capitalism, it's going to be wired towards preserving that system. So it will not actually be wanting to find the leverage points for really transformational change. There is, however, now I think within a lot of policymakers and politicians, the idea that there is an urgent need for change, and there is therefore also the willingness, I think, to focus more on more powerful areas of intervention. However, there's a lot of research that needs to go into that in order to really understand where these areas are. There are basically these three realms of leverage, which I think is really useful. They're very useful as a basic idea. There's reconnecting people to nature, there's restructuring institutions, and there's rethinking how knowledge is created and used in pursuit of sustainability. And with a group like ACAN, obviously reconnecting people to nature is something that we really, that's something that within our groundwork we can really aspire to do. I mean, I've taken people out to onto poetry walks or ecology walks into ACAN the woods, and have felt myself how it really strikes a chord in people to reconnect to nature, and how this is in turn going to influence their thinking, which in turn is going to influence the system that they operate in. And this is a very profound way of influencing a system if you influence the people that are in it and the way that they see things. This is transformational, not if they're going to get their plastic straw at McDonald's, but maybe they're not even going to ever go to McDonald's anymore once they understood what's going on. So that's the idea here. Restructuring institutions would be a thing that's probably a lot of us who have worked in this direction, trying to change institutions. It's kind of like running with your head against a brick wall very often, because institutions tend to be very self-preserving and extremely hard to change. I'm going to have a little bit about that in a second. And then rethinking how knowledge is created. Like I said, there has been a step change within the academic world, definitely. If you look at how natural sciences are approached now at university, with a much more inter and transdisciplinary approach, this has really changed the way that how knowledge is created, and how a lot of things are now in knowledge creation are now geared towards solving sustainability problems, and this is even going into schools now as well. So there's definitely things happening in that realm of leverage, and obviously we need to think of these issues as within a systemic view. Like I said, we can't really break something as complex down into discrete elements and then address these elements separately, because in the end that's not going to really be very very transformational. I'm going to kind of skip over this as well, but this is this Donella Meadows woman who is the godmother of systems thinking, and she has defined all these different points in the system. And again, if you're really into systems thinking, I encourage you to look this up. It's really quite, it looks a bit dry, but it's really quite interesting once you get into it. Because the great thing about sustainability science is that it's always kind of pointing to the real world. It never goes into this realm of it's just science for the sake of science and for the sake of being somehow academic and intellectual and impressing people, which is great. There is a lot of research already on leverage points. As you can see, it's all relatively new as far as research timescales go. A lot of stuff here from 2012. That was a time when there was a lot of stuff being done, and by now there's even more. I've been doing so much groundwork in the past 2 years that I have not kept up to date on the newest sustainability and literature, like I said, because our work kind of consumes so much time. The academic aspect of it then can get lost in everyday work, but I know that the sector is very, very active. If we kind of look at these three realms of deep leverage for sustainability transformation, we have the role of institutions and institutional decline and failure in systemic change. And I think we can all kind of imagine what that means with the way things are going and the crises, the growing crises on all fronts. We can very well imagine that there will be situations where old institutions are going to fail. There might be quite big shocks to existing institutions, be it through wars, revolutions, whatever. And then, of course, that can open up possibilities of change. People's connection to nature, their influences on sustainability outcomes. So, like I said, if people really connect on a deeper emotional level to nature, this will influence the way that they think about things, and that will influence how they themselves behave. This is that behavioral change that we're always trying to affect in people. It is incredibly powerful when once it works. It's a long way to get there sometimes, but it is something that's very, very worthwhile. And I think that's something that those of us who do the groundwork, it's just great to know that we're working on one of the 3 realms of deep leverage for sustainability transformation. It's really worth it. And while we're doing this, the knowledge production on these topics and how we use this knowledge in transformational processes. So it's basically, you can say, restructure institutionally, reconnect to nature, and rethink the way that we're using knowledge towards sustainability. Restructure, reconnect, rethink. So looking at the restructure bit, like I said, institutional change is very crucial, but and the need for research here is into institutional failure and decline, and potentially productive functions of such phenomena. So we can look at cases of institutional failure and decline and what grew out of that, which maybe was better. One example that is often used, a historic example that's often used for that, is the fall of Nazi Germany and all the Nazi institutions, and then how the Allies came in and rebuilt Germany with new institutions, and that of course created a lot of positive momentum for the country. So that's just like one historical that now doesn't have to do with sustainability development, but the development wasn't very sustainable, because then we had the 50s and 60s. But yeah, but it's one of these examples where we had a big institutional failure through a big crisis, which was the Second World War, and then a rebuilding of structures in a way that then actually worked very well. Crises can trigger institutional adaptations towards sustainability. And because we're dealing here with social and societal systems, there's always a response to external or internal pressure, reorganization, learning, adaptation. Institutions may reorganize or decline in the face of a changing environmental or societal conditions. So the key leverage point here is ensuring that institutions are designed to be basically flexible and open to the transformational learning and adaptation opportunities. Now, if you have a system where the institutions are very old and clunky and not generally very well adaptable, because they're being run by a bunch of people who have an interest in keeping them very old and clunky, then of course the collapse of these institutions would be more catastrophic, because they wouldn't be able to, they would at a certain point just crack and fail. Whereas with a more modern design of institutions, and if we compare, for example, the institutions in a country like Finland or Sweden, which are fairly fresh institutions, and they keep kind of working on them, then it's with a country like Britain, for example, which has very clunky institutions, we can see how some of them might be better adapted to transformational learning than the others. But it's definitely something that can be done. Institutions can be changed, even if sometimes it doesn't seem like that. I love this article by Gales, 2011. Purposeful destabilization of unsustainable institutions may create windows of opportunity for change towards sustainability. Which is, I'll just think about what that means. That purposeful destabilization of unsustainable institutions. So this is basically an academic essay calling for a revolution. But also intentional destabilization or even dismantling of institutions bears considerable danger and must be approached with great care and understanding of the institutions under consideration. So, but this is how groundbreaking and really rebellious this science is. We're really talking about academics who are thinking about getting rid of unsustainable institutions. It's a very interesting field of science. It's very much not just traditional sciencey stuff, and you meet very interesting people in there as well. And yes, exactly. There's a lot of interesting research on institutional failure and changes that have been affected by that. What's really important here, to finish up this institutional thing, is that it's important to kind of be aware of how all of these crisis points that exist and that are going to affect our future and that are going to result in a lot of changes. That is, I mean, there's no doubt there are going to be very extreme changes. And these need to be somehow controlled and channeled, because the thing is that if something just collapses and in a very uncontrolled way, there's always the risk of losing important institutional elements, such as knowledge and networks, actor capacity. So you should always try to kind of keep the important elements that you can then build on. And again, this means managing decline, active management of decline, because this is the state we're at, where we're at a point where things are going to decline, and this needs to be managed so that then things can be built from that. And then as the last point that I want to talk about today is this reconnecting. Because again, I think this is where we're doing a lot of really important groundwork, and it's something that's very, very close to my heart, to explore how our connections to the natural world really shape the values and the paradigms that underpin the action of humans. So if we're strengthening the links between people and nature in our local ecosystems, and this is really literally taking people into ACAN woods and telling them about the beech queen of the forest and about how the trees communicate with one another. And if that can somehow shape then their value system, that is a very, very powerful and beautiful thing. And this can be done with people of all ages, and it can be done with in a 1,000 different ways, be it now like an eco walk or poetry thing, or it can be done with art or music or just through talks, experiential stuff. It's very, very, very powerful. And the areas of research that we're looking at there, and this is interesting also for groups like us, how can we kind of feed into that important research, research how different types of human-nature connections interact and can be influenced, for example, research to explore the transformational potential of different types of human-nature connections. This is all stuff that we would kind of, information that we would get from actually working with people. And research on how this connection relates to unsustainability outcome, and how then reconnecting people can lead to system transformations. So this is also a question of how can we bring our experiences as a local group who is dealing with doing things like that, how can we document that and let that go back into the research community. And I know that Jenny and I have been talking about what we can do. And again, it comes down to time and effort, and do we actually have the energy to collect all of this information and make it available to people. But again, I think it's just useful to know that this is an important key area of research, and we're kind of at the pulse of it as a community group. Exactly, because the way that we want to rethink knowledge, we're creating knowledge ourselves, and we want it to be used in influencing transformation processes. So I'm going to skip through this a little as well, because I'm aware this is a lot of stuff. This is something I still wanted to mention though. And that's an important thing to think about, because we've been talking about powerful levers and leverage points. And it's really important to remember we are within the frame of systems thinking, so we are within the frame of this really complicated, it's a really complicated sphere. So there are no simple relations between a given leverage point and systemic change, so that you can never say like, well, if we just get people to connect better to nature, then that is going to solve all the problems that we have in the system. But because we still might run against the wall with the institutions, we still might have to get rid of capitalism in the end. Like it's different leverage points are never independent. And again, what you actually achieve by a change can also be quite unexpected, because the systems and the feedback loops within systems also work in a way that they are not extremely predictable. For example, just one example to finish this off, it could also be that we have relatively shallow leverage points, like for example, agri-environmental payments to farmers. Or, yeah, say we're paying the farmers for something like keeping the hedgerows, and this also comes attached to work where you inform people why this is done, why the hedgerows are important for local biodiversity, and then this may shift the mindset of actors. So in the beginning, the farmers will maybe just be like, yeah, that's great, I don't mind keeping a couple of hedgerows if I get money for it. But then it might actually alter their mindset once they understand more, once they maybe see the increased biodiversity on their fields, and this might then actually lead to them making different decisions along the way. Maybe they're going to stop using pesticides, maybe they're going to go into different forms of farming, who knows. But this would be going from a relatively shallow level, like a payment, to all of a sudden a deep leverage point where their actual thinking is changing. So that would be that transformative behavioral change that would be affected by that. So there's also an interaction between shallow leverage and deep leverage. Good. These are just a couple of knowledge gaps, which they're listed here. I can't say anything about them because they're are knowledge gaps, but you can see there is still quite a lot of research that needs to be done in order to understand better how these leverage points work, what interventions are especially effective, and it's an ongoing struggle. And as I said earlier, the thing is that this all needs to be done quite quickly now. And of course, research in these fields is often underfunded. So it's a struggle to kind of get the knowledge in time to actually then affect meaningful, for it to have a meaningful outcome still. So we need a research agenda that's really centered on the concept of deep leverage points, a framework where we can kind of conceptualize how these leverage points can be effective within society, and this would have a tremendous potential to help to reveal underexplored avenues to sustainability that can help us get to this change that we need, this transformative change. And I want to end it with another quote, this time Tennyson: "So many worlds, so much to do, so little done, such things to be." And yeah, that's the reading list. Got a couple of useful links, and this is all the references. So if you want to do a deep dive now into sustainability sciences, then you can spend the rest of the year reading that kind of stuff. And yeah, I hope it was interesting. I am aware that it's a huge chunk of thing, but I think what I really try to do is kind of put it into context of the work that we're doing and really reinforcing our feeling of that we are part of one of the key realms of leverage, and the work that we're doing is really, really relevant for this change that we need to affect.
Right. Thank you very much indeed, Scott, for that. That's the most elevated presentation I think we've ever had in my time in ACAN. Certainly the most polysyllabic, anyway. So it's a tour de force of covering a very, very complex field.
Yes.
I love questions and comments from anybody. Sheridan says that was fascinating, which indeed it was.
I'm happy.
Who would like to make any comments or questions? So then I've been sitting here trying to apply it to our work, and you know, the connecting with nature is a very powerful point that you have brought to ACAN actually in the last year or two. I was also thinking that using creative approaches, you know, using the arts, using music and so on, is another way of perhaps bridging the gap between people's attitudes and broader systems change, isn't it? It's linked to nature.
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, who would like to comment? Chris?
I'll start things off, Jenny. Yes, I'm sure there'll be lots of comments. Well, I started off thinking, this is very over the top of my head. I haven't got a clue where I am. But bit by bit, I just stayed with it. And what came to me, and I think I must look at it more, is you talked about like revolution, changing things. Well, I'm thinking of something that happened out of the blue, really, to Cuba in, I think, the 50s, when they were suddenly cut off from oil.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yes.
And they had to totally transform and change the way they operated.
That's a really good example.
It is
a lot from them.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember them importing loads of cheap bicycles from somewhere. I don't remember. I mean, when I've looked back, you know, when I've studied it a little bit. But I must study what really happened in Cuba at the time and for the first few years. You know, it's like they couldn't build houses, they couldn't have transport, they had to grow so much more of their own food.
Yeah.
You know, incredible. And it was almost overnight, I think. So anyway, I'll look into that and see how it could, the thinking could be, you know, if we found ourselves in the same situation as Cuba in the 1950s, what would we have to do differently and work back from that? But that would be the most extreme.
It's a really good example, because it would be the system in that case, the Cuban society. There would be the extreme external pressure of a key commodity being removed, and then the system adjusting in surprisingly quickly, because things didn't break down completely. They kept things running, which it's because the capacity of systems to adapt is huge. But there's a whole way of there's a whole line of sustainability scientists who basically say nothing's going to happen until we reach this incredible crisis point. Basically, it's the drive against the wall and then rebuild the skull concept. But there is actually a concept, I've forgotten what it's called. It has a name, which basically says things first need to go and completely. We need a situation like that where the external pressure is so large that, you know, there's a relatively large scale catastrophe, and then the system is going to be able to adapt. And then there are the other scientists who say, well, we think that actually we could, through education and through institutional changes and through these kind of things, we could maybe actually have these changes happen a little bit before we actually hit the wall. But yeah, that's
very good example, that, Chris.
Yeah, really good.
The thought. Other thoughts, comments? At all? No? Eleanor?
Can I ask, it seems to me that the outcome that you're describing is pretty frightening, actually, that it's got to get so bad before we make any positive improvements. Do you believe that? Do you think there's any hope that we could do it? Obviously not gradually, because we've lost gradually completely,
Yes, yeah.
but a little faster and a
Yes.
little more smoothly, so we don't have to hit the brick wall before anything changes.
Yes, because I'm a radical optimist. So I I believe that, and I believe that there is the capacity within systems to change also without the pressure of a Second World War or total destruction of things. But it really has to, for me, it really has to come over affecting this behavioral changes, affecting these value changes in people's heads. I think if there's not a general rethinking of values, and if there's not a general rethinking of the role that profit, growth, and capitalism in general plays, I don't see how it's going to work within. If we stay within that value system, I don't see how it's going to work. However, I do believe that this value system can be changed before everything's going completely down the drain.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's hope for the best.
Fingers crossed.
Sorry, Liz. Yeah.
Hi. Oh God, I've forgotten Scott. I've forgotten your name. Sorry, Scott. That was really interesting what you've just been talking about. Something I really haven't got very much knowledge of at all. And so it's opened up a lot of ideas for me.
I'm happy.
When you were talking, about change. I mean, we have seen change. We've seen how change can happen very quickly if people are given. When I'm talking about COVID, of course.
Yeah.
And people are given a reason by the government that they have to do something which is for the general good.
Yes.
And people do it. We saw it.
Yeah.
They didn't go out. Well, in the main, a few people didn't take any notice, but that mostly people follow if they're given the leadership and the reason, and it's a good enough reason, they will do it. We just haven't got the leadership, have we? We haven't got the political will or the commercial will, the corporate will to do anything about making us changing our future to make us more sustainable in the face of climate change. So I have to agree, revolution.
Yeah. Yes, because we're stuck with the I think that this whole part of changing institutions, and there's really very interesting research into this problem of self-reinforcing institutions that are in feedback loops that are just designed to reinforce the system that they want to keep up. And there, like you said, there might not be any real political interest in taking the leadership and making things more sustainable because they have different interests. They follow a different agenda, and their feedback loops are designed to uphold that system that they're in. And then, of course, if we could change that, like you said with COVID, and in a way, it made, I think, a lot of us quite hopeful to see how quickly these changes could be effective during COVID, because we kind of hope that could we do the same thing to save us all, maybe again. But yes, the question of leadership is definitely key, and I mean there are if you look at for example the global plastic agenda and the work that's being done internationally to try to get the plastic problem under control, there's a lot of willingness from a lot of countries to look at that, and there you see that there's a lot of institutional change, or they're trying to affect a lot of institutional change around that topic. So yeah, it comes down to leadership, of course, and comes down to every single one. And then again, if everyone kind of changes their value system, there might also be different people willing to take up leadership, because of course that's another problem within the system, the reinforcing system, that basically the type of power that you can get right now within this country, for example, would just not appeal to the right people. It always appeals to the wrong people, and that's why we always have the wrong people in power, because they're the ones that choose that career, because it's their system. And yeah, so yes, revolution.
Right. Anybody else want to comment? I had a message to me in the chat from someone, Scott, and I'll ask the question on their behalf, because and I mean, you've given a presentation on this. What is the value of the ongoing slog that we put ourselves through, of lobbying, petitions, emails to MPs, all the rest of it, protests indeed, yeah. You know, the big XR protest almost a year ago now, isn't it? Shockingly, yeah. What is the value of that? Do you think it is worth trying to continue? Because they're all directed at trying to change our clunky institutions, as you call them, yeah, aren't they? They're having no impact at all, arguably. Is it worth slogging on with that sort of thing, in your view?
I think that it's probably, for me, these protests are always kind of not about, like, I never expect them to change the institutions, because that's not, you're not going to change the institution just by doing a sit-in in front of Parliament. That's not going to work. But for me, they're always about getting knowledge out there. So it would be that leverage point of sort of how are we using knowledge to affect sustainability outcomes, and how do we change people's value systems? And I mean, that's something that people who are active in these protests do see, that they talk to people, and they actually have people who change their minds and their value system, and they'll come out and join them. And so yes, I think it is worth it. I think it is a slog, and I think it is, I mean, community work can be
Absolutely.
very, very tiring, but yes, but it is, yes, I do. I mean, I'm doing this job and I believe in it, and I always find the energy to do it, because I really do believe that it is worth it. It's
Yeah. Okay, well, that's perhaps a very good, optimistic and positive note on which to end, unless anyone else wants to add any thoughts or comments. Sheridan, yeah?
Yeah, I guess I'm just thinking, again, you're all being really open with your questions, and it was just rumbling around in my head about how, because almost with some of the work that you can do, you can pick people off one by one, sort of get them involved in, I don't know, in wildlife gardening or whatever angle. But again, how much influence does that have on actually transforming things? And I just would be interested in your views on that, because it seems so small in the scheme of the whole problem, doesn't it?
I think it does in a way, but then in another way, if you're looking at, for example, now you can go into any supermarket, Aldi, and they have a huge vegan selection of stuff. And I mean, I think that was a value change, where a lot of people were thinking, for different reasons, are thinking about a plant-based diet. They're creating that kind of ask for these products, and now it's very easy to be vegan, whereas in the 90s it wasn't. So I think, and that was a huge change. There's if you talk to people who are or like organic farming, that sort of stuff, I think you can see how there were these areas where obviously a lot of people must have changed their minds somewhere along the way and made decisions, consumer decisions, and that has affected quite a big change in the system, in that case, the supermarket system. So, and I mean, that must have all been people one by one who, every single one of them changed their minds and changed their, and it created a movement that was strong enough to actually have a visible effect.
Yeah, and there are, I mean, shops like Fill Up, which exist, which is a refill shop in Alton, exist in most communities now, and wouldn't have done 5 or 10 years. They wouldn't have been able to survive commercially. I mean, there is a slur, not fast enough. Sorry.
Unfortunately, there's one in Petersfield that's closing down.
Oh dear.
Yeah.
Right. I'm very sorry. I'm surprised actually. In Petersfield. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that was
no, you're right, Scott. It is. You can see some of the, if you get a big wave,
the underlying trends anyway. The trends towards reusing and so on are there, aren't they? With our repair cafes and shares and so on.
And just the fact, I think, that people don't look at people like us anymore as if we were complete freaks. But there's the certain understanding in society, I think, that these topics are important and that we're not completely insane for kind of being worried about these things. Whereas if you had eco-anxiety in the 80s, people would just kind of look at you and just not really understand what your problem was. So yeah, and with institutional change, actually, one of the big examples, big good news examples, where international action actually affected really positive change, where of course was the ozone layer and the when they prohibited the aerosols, and I mean that had a huge effect. Even so, there you had an effect of leadership, an example of leadership that was actually done and executed, and the effect that can have if you have that sort of leadership and everyone does it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Eleanor, yes.
Just another point along the same lines that didn't come from leadership, but came from everyday folk, was the campaign not to buy South African fruit. I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember that one. And it definitely contributed to the collapse of apartheid. And that was very much a groundswell of anger about the way they were treating people, which had a significant effect. We do see change, and I think it pays every now and then to go and look for the good news, because otherwise you can get very, very down about the whole system. But there is good news to be found.
Change. I mean, I think the whole movement around wildlife gardening is very powerful, actually, as well. I mean, that's really taken root in recent years, hasn't it? So people are very concerned to make a contribution to saving invertebrates and so on out there. So there is some good stuff. We ought to stop in a minute, I think. So, and then we'll make your comment. The last one.
I was just wondering if our current story on the news about the post office is significant. For 20 years, this terrible thing has been going on, and I have to say, I first read about it a very long time ago.
Very long time ago,
yeah. And I thought I'd seen something, you know, when they won something, I thought, oh, good, it's all sorted out now. And it wasn't until I watched the drama when I realized just how, you know, the depth of it. But because it's become so important and, you know, such a high level news story, and Fujitsu are now having to come on national television and say, of course we're sorry, of course we're going to give you the money, we didn't realize, you know, this sort of thing. And I just wonder what is the tipping point that made this so so topical. And I wonder if, because some of the other news we have with wars breaking out in various parts of the world or just carrying on, it's just so horrible that the story of the post office is far from cozy, but we can kind of comprehend it because we've all got a post office and we can all feel enraged for these people who have been I don't know if what I'm saying is relevant.
Maybe I think the point might really be that, because we were talking about complexity of systems and how that can be so frustrating, right? And I think, yes, this is a fairly easy story. We can all kind of agree on, we can all understand it. If you compare it to, for example, the situation in Gaza, where everyone would kind of be like, oh, I don't really want to get into that because it's so complicated, it's so messed up, it's so unclear. But the post office, yes, we can get behind these people who've been unjustly treated there. And I think that is exactly what we are struggling with, right? Jenny and I have talked about this many times. It's easy to get people interested in wildlife gardening, but it's difficult to then talk to them about climate change. Yeah, exact same thing. There is a tendency to prefer the simpler problems to the really complex problems. Actually, the scientific term is wicked problems for these really complex ones.
Right. So Sanford's just put a meeting on Twitter. I work on human and systems change.
Oh, great.
Interesting. I'll have to follow that up.
The Wisocracy. That sounds interesting.
Yeah, Wisocracy.
I've copied that.
Yeah, you got it. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Well, on that note, which is moderately optimistic, we all have agency. That's what we're really saying, isn't it? We all have some agency to make a difference in all the work that we do. And if you do stand back, you can see shifts around us. Definitely. We just have to keep plugging away, I think. And hopefully one of these major institutions will change. Well, we need to get the big corporates, but that's a whole other story. Yeah, isn't it? That's where the change needs to come from.
Yeah.
So thank you, Scott, both for the presentation, because you're covering very complex stuff in a way that was intelligible to all of us.
Thank you.
And you see from the comments in the chat box how much that's been appreciated and generated a very interesting and important discussion, I think, as well. So thank you ever so much for that. So we'll give you a little clap. Okay. And we'll finish the meeting there. Thank you all for coming and for your interest.